and welcome to Hospice Insights, the Law and Beyond, where we connect you to what matters in the ever-changing world of hospice and palliative care.
Upping the ante, will CMS's enhanced oversight efforts cause hospices to fold? Wow, what a daunting title we put on this, Brian. This is daunting. I'm frightened, even beginning this podcast. Fold, that's serious business. What are you thinking here, Brian?
Well, I love coming up with these titles and, a little bit of a poker reference in there, but I guess it is daunting. Nobody wants to fold in a poker hand. You're out of the game at that point. But boy, it just seems the way CMS is proceeding with some of these efforts, a lot is on the line for these hospices that are new hospices or that are recently acquired hospices. So I think CMS is approaching that point where they've heard enough about those 4 states. They've heard enough about what's wrong with hospice from Congress, and they're really becoming they're trying to follow through with those people who are essentially their bosses.
So, what is this enhanced oversight for those listening who might not? What's the skinny on that?
Yeah, well, that's a program CMS created where they're going to focus on 4 states: California, Arizona, Texas, Nevada, and they're going to do prepayment medical review of certain hospices. It could be newly started hospices that have been reactivated after being deactivated for a while, hospices that have recently been acquired. But for some reason, they are kind of new to the submission of claims under their current ownership or leadership. And they're going to do a medical review. And then from that medical review, there can flow consequences. Like you get a prepayment review of your claims. And based upon how well you do, they can revoke your billing privileges. They can terminate your provider number, bar you from enrollment, put you on the preclusion list, which really relates more to managed care organizations or Medicare Advantage organizations. So a lot of pretty serious consequences can be visited upon hospices.
Well, and we expect this is going to go, and I think CMS has said so, beyond the 4 states eventually. But, new providers, I think all of the MACs did new provider TPE, but this is a little bit different. And I think it's the consequences are getting really serious. I mean, when we've dealt with new provider TPE, just sort of went on and on. And, and I mean, I'm not saying it was pleasant, but, and from real life circumstances, because we've been dealing with, I'm getting revoked now because you looked at a very small sample of claims and I'm now going to revoke your provider number, and that's everything. I mean, you have appeal rights, but it's fairly serious. And so I think the difference here is the consequences and the whole number of claims that you're getting a shot at looking before they cut the cord and be like, no, we think this is an abuse of billing privileges. So
yeah, it can, as far as the claims they're reviewing, it can seem like it's too overwhelming, or it seems like it's not enough for them to really get a fair picture of how the hospice is performing. So they can do a 100% prepayment review, and that's the too much category. They're reviewing everything. They're holding up payment. It can create cash flow issues for a new hospice or recently acquired hospice just starting out. Every single claim in a month is being reviewed, and then a fair portion of them being denied. And then you got to get the appeal process going to even get paid. So that's on the, it seems like too much. On the not enough side, you could have a lot of claims being submitted. Maybe they'll just sample 10, and then maybe a month later they'll sample 10 more. And they find errors with 8, 12 claims total out of all your claims based upon 2 small samples like that. And then you get a notice that they're revoking they're terminating your Medicare number. They're revoking your billing privileges based upon such a small sample. So they kind of, the process itself can be daunting. And then the consequences, even if the process is not that hurtful, just producing records for 20 claims or so, the consequence can seem to be disproportionate to what they've really looked at by that time.
Well, and CMS has real broad authority, and because we just got done, and thankfully we were able to turn things around and prevail on a revocation that came as a result of this provisional TPE or enhanced oversight. I just don't get the PPEO, like that is not something that stays with me. That acronym I'm not adopting. I always just say provisional TPE or whatever, but we just got done prevailing in one of those. And I think it was troubling in that the error rate, when you think about it, isn't really that high when you compare it to regular TPE, right? For, one MAC, you can have an error rate of 25% and essentially get off a TPE. Well, CMS, I think, is taking a pretty hard line, and they're expecting really, really good performance right out of the gates. And, it takes a while to get through the appeal process. So you may already get the termination letter and you're trying to hurry along the appeal process, but it takes a while to get to ALJ, which is where you're going to get the most movement. So it's converging a lot of things at the same time.
Yeah, and CMS is certainly more directly involved in the decision making on these kind of PPEO reviews.
It doesn't ring for you either.
Well,
Let's start a new trend.
Well, there's another. When you want to talk to CMS, you got to call PEOG, PEOG,
Yes.
or something. So there's yet another kind of another acronym for us to try to remember. As I get older and older, it doesn't get any easier to do that. But yeah, CMS is more directly involved, both in deciding, well, how much of an error is enough to say we're going to revoke the billing privileges. Like you mentioned with TPEs for some MACs, it's 25%, and the MACs set that. Each MAC has really a different percentage, but the MACs have some control, and the consequences, you go on to another round and another round, and before you really get potential consequences. Here, I think they're more strict. They're not going to allow. They're going to even come down on you with a more modest error rate, and they're not going to wait as long as several rounds of a TPE. It's going to happen quickly. You mentioned that appeal process. Yes, there's an appeal process, but when you appeal, that doesn't stop the revocation from happening. It's kind of like payment suspensions. It's kind of like some of these other real draconian consequences that you can appeal, but the odds are you're not going to win, or you're going to have to survive through months of no revenue before you get a hearing in front of an ALJ or some appellate decision. So you really need to, when you kind of are in one of these situations, you've got to act quickly in a number of respects. First, you're getting a PPEO set of claim reviews. You want to make sure you're submitting a high quality claim. I mean, you got to submit whatever documents are, but you want to make sure you know what your documentation looks like, because there's likely to be a round two, and whatever you can do to improve your processes from round one to round two to show you're getting better, you want to do that, and hopefully you won't have to appeal a revocation. But once you get that revocation notice, you'll have like 65 days to seek reconsideration. But you might want to begin some informal advocacy, gather information that shows how your provider looks in a more appropriate context than just a review of 20 claims. And try some informal advocacy by reaching out to, not necessarily, I mean, you could try the MAC, you can try CMS, to try to share that larger context to see if that has any effect on the decision making over at CMS.
And I think that this is a painful process, and obviously you want to do everything you can to avoid it. But this is for sure going to happen if you're a new provider or you've had a change of ownership. And so I think how you approach transactions those listeners who are doing transactions, I mean, due diligence is always important. And, more, I think the focus has been more on like, oh, well, indemnification and, if I get claims denied that relate to when you own this, I'll go after you. But I think understanding their audit experience prior to buying them, in addition to your like normal diligence, like how good is their documentation, but have they been tested? Because buying a hospice who's never been tested, I think can be challenging because they've never really been, put to the test, so to speak. And so, and we talk about this all the time in our audit podcast, like prior review is really helpful, and how you prevailed in those is very helpful. And so when we've dealt with the exact situations we're talking about here, we were able to say, hey, we've been reviewed by a UPIC or whoever and done really well. And that was helpful for CMS to know that. And it's something they strongly considered and sort of reversed the tide there. But I think another thing that was a bit surprising to us, because this is all a new thing, but now we know is, and Brian, you and I have dealt with this numerous times, is when you have one legal entity and has multiple provider numbers under that one tax ID, the government can, if you have an overpayment or recoupment, they can take money from that other provider number. But in this context of revoking billing privileges, they can do that in this context too. And if that provider number is completely not even a hospice, but they're using hospice findings to, they can do that. And so I think that that's a real, I guess, being thoughtful about how you structure your transactions. And I think best to have one provider number and one legal entity. We won't get into all of the structuring considerations because that's sort of another podcast, but I just think people need to be aware, because I think in the olden days, people kept all of their business lines in one legal entity, and that it isn't ideally the way you want to structure things ever, but also for this too, when you're doing acquisitions, you don't want to structure it like that. But I guess, Brian, what other things do you think are helpful for people to know in terms of risk mitigation? I mean, obviously it's not a secret this is going to happen, but any other sort of words of wisdom as we close up?
Well, I think when you talk about the acquisitions and the due diligence, one thing that has been of concern to CMS is medical directors who are spread thin among multiple hospices. So if you're in the business or have an interest in acquiring a hospice, take a look at that medical director. Is that medical director somebody who is working for multiple hospices that might raise a red flag to CMS? So I don't know that that's something you typically look at, is tell me who else your medical director works for. But I think that would be an important thing to find out, because that person is really key to to the number one reason why claims are getting denied in these reviews. And that is for a lack of support for a terminal prognosis. That kind of all goes back to how the medical director is assessing patients, documenting narratives. So I think that's something to look at. And as you mentioned, other audit history. You and I have talked about the silver lining of those reviews prior of being audited is you get tested and you can improve your processes. And that's one of the things. There is a regulation that allows CMS to extend these revocations to other provider numbers. One of the things they consider is, has that other provider number had success or a lack of success in audits that have affected it? So I think looking at the audit history, that'll tell you whether you're buying more risk or you're buying something that eliminates risk because you had a good UPIC result. And so going through the PPEO process, if they decide to revoke, maybe you can say, hey, but you reviewed 10 claims. We just had 50 claims reviewed, and we got an 80%, 90% success rate.
Yeah.
Take that into account. That's the kind of thing that might change minds at CMS.
Yeah. Because diligence shouldn't be like, oh, they got you picked, they must be bad, I don't want to buy them. I don't think most people think that. But I actually, for the exact same reason you said, it's actually a good thing. Now, if they got you picked and, there was no happy ending there, that's a different story. But I guess one final note on your medical director thing, right? The government changed the law to now require medical directors to be reported on your 855. And so the government just doesn't ask for information just because. They actually use that. And now they can connect the dots of who are medical directors at multiple different hospices. And so even if you don't know who your medical director, maybe another medical director for another hospice, the government's going to know that. Now, that has to mean that people are actually reporting what they should. But, once we get through revalidation cycle, right, you're not reporting your medical director and your 855, it's going to get rejected and they're going to ask you to report that. And so I do think that's a really important point, Brian, of what other hospices they're at, but also what is their history. I mean, we've dealt with some issues with medical directors when we filed, we got a new medical director and essentially Medicaid was like, yeah, we don't want to work with this physician. So, and we looked at their history and didn't see anything, but clearly the government knew something that we didn't know. So anyway, I think a lot of focus is being paid on that medical director. And so for so many reasons, that role is just so important. So anyway, Brian, well, this was a bit of a downer, but anyway, that's, we do uplifting things and we have to, be the Debbie Downers too, I guess. But, when we got involved in this most recent thing, I mean, it was all hands on deck but we were able to turn things around, which was a really exciting win for our team.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's a downer that these are happening. And as I say many times, CMS casts a wide net to a fault. And they capture a lot of good providers out there. So that certainly is a downer. We know CMS has a job to do. It's trying to weed out the bad folks. It catches some good guys. But yeah, the happy part of this story is, we helped one of those good guys get out of a jam. And there's a pathway to get out of these jams. If you kind of have that quality in mind, if you're kind of dedicated to the hospice mission
and a great legal team at your side.
Well, of course, that goes
putting all hands on deck, working round the clock to find a solution and find a way to win. So, which is what we do here. So, all right, Brian. Well, good title. Thanks for the info. I'm glad that we had to relive this, but it was nice that we were able to share a story that did have a happier ending. So
all right,
I'm going to be bright-sided on this. So I always don't want to end on a positive note, Brian. So
you bet, and perhaps to happier topics to come. So
yes, thank you.
Yep, thanks, Meg.
Well, that's it for today's episode of Hospice Insights, The Law and Beyond. Thank you for joining the conversation. To subscribe to our podcast, visit our website at hushblackwell.com or sign up wherever you get your podcasts. Until next time, may the wind be at your back.